Isn't it wondrous that music that is 400 years old and a bit can inspire us still today, just as much as scriptures that are 2,000 years old can inspire us. And my thanks to both Sandra and Hugh for their readings tonight of quite long passages of scripture, but beautifully read. I want to take for my text this evening a phrase that's repeated a number of times in that New Testament reading that Hugh gave us. Listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Now that phrase is, as you know, from the book of Revelation. In its early chapters, which people often don't bother engaging with because they fear the book of Revelation, because it does get pretty complicated with lots of very demanding imagery later on. But you know, the first few chapters are well worth a read, because in those chapters they contain some letters written by Jesus through the writer John to the churches. Some of them praise certain churches for the way that they're faithfully following the gospel. Others, not so much. I don't know if you caught the word to the church in Sardis tonight, but it was along the lines of, you think you're alive, don't you? But actually, you're quite dead. Yeah? It wasn't very encouraging for them to hear such words, was it? We don't really know who John was. Hugh, not incorrectly, because this is certainly how he is known, introduced him as John the Divine, as the writer of Revelation. But who was he? Was he, as some scholars suggest, John the Apostle, who had in fact spent time with Jesus? Was he the author of John's Gospel? There are other scholarly views that say he was someone else altogether. What is sure is that when he was writing, at around 70 years after the death of Christ, so we're talking about the turn of the first century, 70 years after Jesus' death, well, he felt, it's clear from his writing, that the churches were in a pretty crucial period in their life. They'd been established in the decades following Jesus' death and resurrection, and they had initially been promised that Jesus was going to return very soon. That was their expectation. That's what we hear recorded in the Gospels that were by then circulating among the churches. Promises of Jesus' return, very suddenly, very quickly, any day now. But you know, by the last decade of the first century, when the book of Revelation was being written, well, many were beginning to doubt this prophecy of the second coming. Some of the churches were frankly beginning to fray at the edges. Some, like the church at Sardis, were pretty dead. They had lost their first love, and they had lost hope that Jesus was ever going to return. It seems that whoever John was, John the Apostle, John the Divine, John of Patmos is another way in which he's described, whoever he was, he clearly wanted to reignite the faith of those churches that were struggling. And he wanted to reignite their faith in the second coming of Jesus. He wanted them to be as ready as possible for this great event that was to come. That's why the rest of the book of Revelation is so full of glorious imagery. The new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. Gorgeous stuff, isn't it? But read it in that context, the context of offering hope to people who had begun to lose hope. To all the seven churches, John writes that they must listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. But listening to the Spirit, it's hard work, isn't it, my brothers and sisters? There's always the great danger of thinking that we've heard God's voice speaking to us or pushing us in a particular direction. But then on reflection, we find that we were really hearing our own voice. Our own desires, our own needs can sometimes colour the clarity with which we hear God, feel God. I don't want to suggest it's a very rare person indeed who hears God speaking in audible words. It's more of a sense, isn't it? It's more of a discovery. It's the blending of wisdom with prayer and the Spirit that leads us forward. But I tend to think that that sense of perhaps hearing a little bit too much of what they desired is what happened with all this talk of an imminent second coming of Jesus. To those who lived with him during his time on earth, his loss must have been devastating. Can you imagine it? They've been with him, they've hung on his every word, they've seen him as the source of their life and of their faith, their inspiration. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and now he's gone. He's gone. Surely he's coming again. And they developed their belief that Jesus had not been wiped out by death. In fact, they asserted that he had risen from the dead. And not only had he conquered death, but that he would return with power and glory to rule over this troublesome world in which they lived, this world of violence that they had to cope with every day. But let me ask you this. The trouble with thinking of Jesus as a mighty conqueror and a mighty ruler of the earth who's going to come down and beat up the nasties who are in charge runs a bit contrary to what Jesus himself taught. His whole approach, was it not, was to invite and cajole people into his kingdom. A kingdom which he stated to Pontius Pilate, as I'm sure you remember, was specifically not of this world. His kingdom was a way of life, entered into freely and voluntarily, in which love and self-sacrifice were the new law. The idea that Jesus would return and impose a mighty and powerful kingdom, sweeping aside his enemies in the process, with angels coming to fight at his right hand and dominate the world, doesn't really sit well with the kind of invitational mode in which Jesus actually operated when he was living among us and when we could see how he lived and how he wanted us to live. In fact, that idea of conquering owes rather more to the old Jewish notions of a Messiah. You know, the ones who expected Jesus to ride into Jerusalem on a white charger and demolish the Romans. But Jesus was stubborn. He didn't do that, did he? He came in on his little humble donkey instead. But you can't blame people who feel under the heel of oppression. You can't blame both the Jews and the new Christian Jews who were around at that time for wanting someone to rescue them from the misery of the world in which they lived, living under empire, under an empire of violence. And we should not therefore be surprised to find prophets and preachers of the day encouraging their followers to hold on, and that any day now Jesus will come and batter the Romans into submission. 2,000 years later, those promises don't feel quite so powerful, do they? We might well ask, what's happened to this second coming? And we might certainly wonder what the Spirit is saying to the churches today. It doesn't take a lot of searching on the internet, let me tell you, to find that the idea of a second coming and indeed the end of all things figures highly in the minds of some rather imaginative individuals. Did you know, for example, that a couple of weeks ago, an American Christian organized the importation to Israel of some purebred red heifers. Have you heard about the red heifer? No? No? Well, okay. Check it out. Type red heifers into your search engine when you get home and you'll see what I mean. Now, this is because there's a belief that at the end of the world, when the new temple in Jerusalem is rebuilt, that on that day, one of the vital liturgical actions that must be performed according to the ancient Jewish laws is the sacrifice of a pure red heifer without a single hair of any other color. So this American guy has arranged to import these heifers. He is colluding with another organization that is founded specifically to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. These people, who comprise, I have to tell you, both some Jews and some very evangelical Christians, are positively salivating over the present conflicts in the Middle East, especially those between Israel and Palestine, and of course with Iran. They detect within these conflicts the promise of Armageddon and the end of the world. Any of them would, of course, tell you that they're not looking forward to all that violence. They wouldn't wish all that warfare and bloodshed and violence on anyone. But according to their reading of the Bible, this is what must happen before Jesus will return. So they encourage it. They're quite happy to continue selling their weapons to both sides in the conflict, in the hope that this will bring Jesus amongst us sooner. Oh, happy day. Let's kill a few more people so that Jesus will come. Yeah. They're happy to lobby and fundraise for the rebuilding of the Jewish temple, which I'm sure you realize would mean first the demolition of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. I imagine that will go down very well. So what is it that the Spirit is really saying to the churches? Well, I'm not sure. I'm not certain. I might be projecting my own thoughts, my own logic, my own desires, and I might be making God in my own image, but I don't think so. This language of conquering, of world domination, of deliberate war-making to bring about the end of the world seems about as far from the teachings of Jesus as it's possible to get, don't you think? In his Sermon on the Mount, for example, I don't quite remember Jesus saying, "Blessed are the war makers." Am I wrong? Did he say, "Blessed are the weapons manufacturers"? No, I don't think he did he? He said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." In his parables, did he compare the coming of the kingdom to the onslaught of an invading army? Or did he talk instead about the kingdom as something that gives salt, flavor, light to the world? It was for him a precious treasure, a lost coin, diligently searched for individually and personally by each of us. So what is the Spirit saying to the churches, especially about the second coming of Christ? Well, I think the Spirit is saying that Christ does come again every time that a neighbor reaches out to their neighbor. Every time that a homeless person finds a warm bed for the night, thanks to the kindness of strangers, Jesus comes. Every time that someone who's been wronged and finds the strength to forgive their aggressor, just as Jesus did when he cried, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Christ comes again. Every time peace is established in the face of war, Christ comes again. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, and you are at liberty to disagree with me, this is a radical view. But I do believe in the second coming of Jesus, but not as a mighty warrior upon the clouds, coming to bash heads together and set up a new earthly government on which he will reign by diktat and compulsion for eternity. That's not the vision I have of the second coming. My vision is that the kingdom of heaven will not be established by a sword, but rather it's a gradual process, a holy infection, if you like, one that takes place every time we invite Jesus to set up his throne, not over the whole world, but just on the seat of our own hearts. It takes place every time we sincerely acknowledge him as the Lord of our lives, and then set out to live his kingdom laws of love and sacrifice. Can I get an amen?